The stone gave way without warning, and the mountain seemed to exhale. Eliza Hartwell heard it before she saw it, a low groan deep in the rock, the sound a thing makes when it has held itself together for 100 years, and can no longer bear the weight of one more strike of the chisel. She had been carrying water up the terraced path of Hollow Ridge Quarry, the pails swinging heavy against her knees, when the whole face of the northern wall shuddered and slid. Men shouted. Someone screamed a name that was swallowed by the roar of falling rock. Dust rose in a pale curtain, and through it Eliza saw the shape of a man vanish beneath a slab the size of a cottage door. She did not remember setting down the pails. She would tell herself later that she must have, because she found them afterward sitting neatly at the path's edge, though she had no memory of placing them there. What she remembered was running toward the dust, instead of away from it, while every other soul on that ridge was already scrambling backward, shouting for the foreman, shouting for rope, shouting for anyone but themselves to go first. Nobody went first. Nobody but her. The quarrymen stood at the rubble's edge with their hands raised uselessly to their mouths, calling the fallen man's name into a cloud that did not answer. The overseer, a broad man named Tolliver, bellowed for a plank and a pry bar, but his boots did not move, and Eliza understood in that instant, with a clarity that frightened her more than the rockfall itself. That fear had rooted every man there to the ground. She was 17 years past, knowing that hesitation could kill a person just as surely as stone could. She went to her knees at the base of the slide and began to dig. Her hands found a boot first, half buried, still and heavy in a way that made her stomach drop. She dug faster, ignoring the sting of shattered rock biting into her palms. Ignoring Tolliver's shouted warning that the whole ledge might come down again if she did not step back. A splinter of slate opened a shallow cut along the heel of her thumb, and she did not feel it. Not then. She worked her fingers beneath a broken slab and heaved with a strength she did not know she possessed, and when it did not move, she found a smaller stone to wedge beneath it as a lever, the way her father had taught her to move furniture too heavy for one pair of arms. Someone help her. A voice cried out at last, and only then did two of the younger quarrymen come forward, shamefaced, to add their hands to hers. But by the time they arrived, Eliza had already cleared enough rubble to see a shoulder, a jaw slack with unconsciousness, a face grey with dust and blood from a gash above the brow. He was a stranger to her, not one of the regular quarrymen she recognized from the village, not a face she had seen at market or at chapel. He wore a labourer's coarse shirt, sweat darkened and torn now at the collar, and his hands, when she finally freed them from beneath the stone, were rough enough to have known real work. Though something in their shape, some unbruised elegance beneath the calluses, struck her as strange even in that frantic moment. She had no time to wonder at it. His chest was not rising. "He isn't breathing," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. She had watched her mother nurse half the village through fever and injury before consumption took her 3 winters past, and some remembered instinct moved through Eliza's hands before her mind caught up to it. She turned his head to the side, cleared his mouth of dust and grit with 2 fingers, and pressed the heel of her palm hard against his breastbone. Once, twice, willing something in him to catch and hold. On the 4th press he convulsed beneath her hands and coughed rock dust and blood across her sleeve, drawing a ragged, whistling breath that was the most beautiful sound Eliza had heard in all her life. The men around her erupted into relieved shouting, but Eliza had no attention left for them. The stranger's eyes had opened, dark, unfocused, glassy with pain, and for one suspended moment they found her face and held there, as though she were the only solid thing in a world gone to rubble and dust. "You're bleeding," he rasped, and it took her a moment to understand he meant her, not himself, for her hand had left a smear of red across his collar where she'd gripped him to turn his head. "Never mind that," she said. Lie still. You've a stone the size of a hay cart to thank for that cut on your brow, and I'll not have you undoing my work by trying to sit up like a fool." Something flickered across his bloodied face that might, in a man less battered, have been the beginning of a smile. Then his eyes rolled back, and he went slack again, and Eliza's heart clenched with a fear disproportionate, she would later think, to what a stranger's life ought to mean to her. They carried him down from the ridge, on a hurdle of lashed planks, 6 men bearing his weight with the careful solemnity of pallbearers, who had, against all expectation, been given back their charge alive. Tolliver wanted to send him to the parish infirmary in Thorncross, 2 hours distant by cart. But Eliza looked at the greyness of the stranger's face, the shallow catch of his breath, and said with a firmness that surprised even her that 2 hours might undo what she had only just accomplished. "Bring him to my cottage," she said. "It's nearest." "I've tended worse than this." She had not, in truth, tended anything quite like this. A man broken in body but clearly, by the fineness beneath his rough clothing, not born to the life the clothing suggested. But she did not say that part aloud. She only walked ahead of the hurdle-bearers down the terraced path, her apron stained red and grey, her hands throbbing with cuts she had not yet let herself feel, already running through in her mind which herbs she had dried for fever, which linens could be torn for bandages, whether there was enough willow bark left in her mother's old tin to make a tea for the pain that would surely come once. He woke fully to it. The cottage was small, 2 rooms and a loft, set at the edge of the village where the lane gave way to orchard, and it had been Eliza's alone since her father's death. The previous autumn had left her without kin, closer than a widowed aunt 3 villages distant. She had managed on her own since then by taking in mending, by helping at the Quarry infirmary hut when the overseer's wife needed an extra pair of hands, by selling preserves at market. She was accustomed to solitude. She was not accustomed to 6 quarrymen tramping mud across her swept floor, while she cleared her own narrow bed of its quilt and directed them, with the crisp authority of a woman twice her age, to lay the stranger down upon it. Once they had gone, once the door had closed on the last curious, murmuring quarryman, Eliza stood alone in the hush of her cottage, with an unconscious stranger bleeding quietly into her mother's linens, and allowed herself, for exactly 1 breath, to feel the trembling in her own hands. Then she set to work. She cleaned the gash above his brow with boiled water and a clean cloth, wincing in sympathy each time he stirred beneath her touch without waking. She bound his ribs, which she suspected, though she could not be certain, having no physician's training beyond what her mother had passed to her, were cracked rather than broken, for he could draw breath, however painfully, without the grating sound she had once heard from a man with a shattered rib cage. She set a poultice of comfrey and yarrow against the worst of the bruising along his side, and she stitched the cut on his brow with a fine needle and thread meant for mending lace, her hands steady now that there was a clear task before them, though her mind kept circling back, unbidden, to the way his eyes had found hers in the wreckage, and held. It was near midnight before he woke again, and Eliza was dozing in the chair she had drawn beside the bed, a single tallow candle guttering on the small table between them, when she heard him draw a sharp breath and go rigid with pain. "Be still," she said at once, coming half out of her chair. "You've cracked ribs and a knock on the head that would have felled an ox. If you move about, you'll undo my stitching, and I'll have wasted good lace thread on you for nothing." He turned his head slowly toward her voice, and in the candlelight she saw his eyes clear by degrees, moving from confusion to focus to something that looked, oddly, like wonder. "You're the one who dug me out," he said. His voice was hoarse, but there was a cultivation in it, a precision of speech, that struck her again as ill-fitting for a quarry labourer. She noted it and set it aside, as she had set aside the smoothness of his hands. "I am. With your own hands. I remember," He stopped, wincing as he tried to lift his head, and she pressed a firm palm to his shoulder to still him. With my own hands, because every other man on that ridge had turned to stone himself. Waiting for someone braver to go first. Now hold still, or I'll bind your wrists to the bedposts as well as your ribs. That, at last, drew a real laugh from him, though it broke off quickly into a wince. You would too, I would. What is your name? Eliza Hartwell. She reached for the cup of willow bark tea cooling on the table and helped him raise his head enough to drink, one hand cradling the back of his skull with a gentleness that belied her briskness of speech a moment before. And yours? There was the smallest hesitation before he answered, so small she would not think of it again until much later, when it would return to her with the force of understanding, and then he said, Julian, only Julian. No surname offered, and something in her did not press for one, sensing, perhaps, that a man freshly dragged from beneath a mountain owed no explanations to anyone before morning. Well then, Julian, she said, easing him back against the pillow, you'll sleep now, and you'll drink what I give you, and you'll not so much as think of standing until I say you may. Do we understand each other? You give orders like a general, he murmured, already fading again towards sleep, his voice slurring soft at the edges. Someone must, since the lot of you at that quarry seem incapable of deciding anything for yourselves in a crisis. He was asleep before she finished the sentence, his breathing evening out beneath the bandages she had wound so carefully around his ribs, and Eliza sat back down in her chair and watched the candle burn lower, wondering, though she told herself firmly it was no business of hers, what manner of man had hands too fine for quarry work, and a voice too fine for a labourer's tongue, and why he had been swinging a hammer at Hollow Ridge at all. He did not tell her the truth in the days that followed, though she would come to understand, much later, that this was not quite the same as lying to her. He had come to the quarry, he said when she pressed him gently over the following week, because he had needed work that asked nothing of a man's name or history, only his back and his hands, and because he had needed, for reasons he did not explain and she did not demand, to be somewhere entirely unlike the place he had come from. Eliza took this to mean he was a man running from debt, or from a broken engagement, or from some family shame. The quarry was full of such men, second sons and disgraced clerks and runaway apprentices, who arrived with false names and left again before anyone thought to ask real ones. She did not judge him for it. She had her own reasons for keeping to herself, for refusing the 2 offers of marriage that had come her way since her father's death, for finding a strange contentment in a solitary cottage at the edge of an orchard. What she had not expected was how quickly his company became a thing she looked forward to. He was, she discovered as the days passed and his strength slowly returned, a man of unexpected humour beneath his guardedness, quick to notice the small absurdities of village life, and quicker still to make her laugh despite herself, while she was meant to be scolding him for trying to rise before she permitted it. He asked after the orchard, after the quarry, after the families of the village, and listened to her answers with a fullness of attention she had rarely encountered in anyone, let alone a man she had known only days. He asked about her mother, and when Eliza told him, briefly, of the fever that had taken her, he did not offer the empty condolences she had grown so weary of hearing, but only said, quietly, that kind of loss does not truly leave us. It only becomes something we learn to carry differently, in a tone that told her, without her needing to ask, that he had carried some grief of his own. You've lost someone too, she said, not quite a question. My father, he answered, after a pause long enough that she thought he might not answer at all, some years past now. And more recently, he stopped himself, and something closed over his face like a shutter drawn against weather. It doesn't bear speaking of. She did not press him. She had learned, in her own grief, the mercy of not being made to speak of things before she was ready, and she extended that same mercy to him now, though it cost her something to swallow her curiosity. By the second week he was strong enough to sit in the small chair by her hearth of an evening, and by the third he had taken, without her quite noticing when it began, to helping her with small tasks about the cottage, mending a fence post, splitting kindling with a care for his still healing ribs that made her scold him even as she was secretly grateful for the help, holding a skein of wool for her to wind, while she told him stories of the village he had not yet had time to learn. He was clumsy at first with the wool, laughing at his own incompetence in a way that struck her as strange for a man of his evident intelligence, until she realized, with a small jolt, that he had likely never in his life been asked to hold wool for anyone, that whatever life he had left behind had not required such small domestic competencies of him. It was on one such evening, with the fire low and the wool half wound, and his hands warm, where they brushed hers passing the skein between them, that she caught him watching her with an expression she could not name, and did not in that moment want to name, for fear of what naming it might make true. "What is it?" she asked, when the silence had stretched too long to be comfortable. "I was only thinking," he said slowly, "that I have known a great many people in my life who were praised for their courage, and not one of them, I think, would have gone to their knees in falling rock to dig out a stranger, while braver-seeming men stood back and watched. They weren't braver-seeming. They were frightened, same as I was. You went forward anyway. Someone had to." She busied herself with the wool to avoid his gaze. "It wasn't courage, Julian. It was only that I couldn't bear to stand there and do nothing while a man died in front of me. That isn't bravery. That's only—" she searched for the word. "That's only being unable to live with the alternative." "I think," he said quietly, "that is precisely what courage is." She looked up at that, and found him watching her still, with a steadiness that made her breath catch in a way she had not felt since before her mother's death had taught her to guard her heart carefully against hoping for anything at all. She thought, in that moment, that she might have leaned toward him, that he might have reached for her hand, that something might have been said or done that could not be unsaid or undone. But a knock came at the door just then, sharp and urgent, and the moment scattered like startled birds. It was Tolliver's boy, breathless from running, come to say that a rider had arrived at the Quarry office asking urgently after the injured stranger, a rider in fine livery bearing the crest of a great house, and that the overseer begged to know whether the man called Julian was fit to receive him. Eliza turned to look at Julian, and found his face gone pale and still, all the warmth of a moment before extinguished as thoroughly as a snuffed candle. "Julian," she said slowly, "what is this?" He did not answer at once. He rose from the chair with a care that spoke of ribs not yet fully healed, and crossed to the small window, and looked out at the darkening lane as though searching it for an escape that was not there. "I had hoped," he said at last, "for a little more time before this found me. Before what found you." He turned back to her, and something in his bearing had changed, not the man she had come to know these 3 weeks, careful and warm and quick to laugh, but someone straighter, graver, a man wearing an authority she had not seen in him before, though she understood now, looking at him, that it had been there all along, buried beneath the Quarry dust and the borrowed shirt, and the deliberate anonymity of a stranger's given name. "My name is Julian Ashford," he said. "I did not lie to you in that. But I did not tell you the whole of it, and I am sorry for that now, more sorry than I know how to say. I am the Duke of Wrenmoor." The words fell into the small room like a second rockslide, and Eliza felt the floor of her understanding give way beneath her every bit as suddenly as the Quarry ledge had given way beneath him. "The Duke," she repeated. "Hollow. I came to the Quarry under another name, because I needed." He stopped, raked a hand through his hair, tried again. My father died 4 years past, and left the dukedom to me sooner than either of us expected. And in the years since I have been surrounded by men who tell me only what they think I wish to hear. And by a betrothal arranged before I was old enough to have any say in it, to a woman I do not love and who does not love me, and by an estate full of people who see the title before they see the man wearing it. I came here, to this quarry, to this village, because I wished for once to be seen as myself. Only myself. Nothing more. And you thought the way to accomplish that, Eliza said, and heard her own voice shaking with something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but some new raw thing without a name, was to let a village girl dig you out of a rockslide with her bare hands, and stitch your wounds with her mother's lace thread, and sit up half the night nursing you, all without once telling her that you were laughing at her taking orders from a duke. I was never laughing at you. He took a step toward her and stopped when she stepped back. Eliza, I swear to you, nothing I have said to you these past weeks was false. Not one word of it. Except the one word that would have changed everything. Would it have? His voice cracked on the question, something desperate beneath the ducal composure. Tell me honestly, if I had woken in that bed and told you the truth at once, would you have spoken to me as you did? Would you have scolded me for trying to rise too soon, or laughed with me over the wool, or told me about your mother, if you had known from the first moment that I was a duke? Eliza did not answer, because she did not know, and because she suspected, with a bitter clarity, that he was right to ask it, that the weeks of ease and warmth between them had only been possible because she had believed him to be no one in particular, an ordinary man with rough hands and a runaway's evasiveness, and not a duke whose rank alone would have built a wall between them from the very first hour. You should have told me, she said instead, quieter now, all the fight gone out of her voice and replaced with something more exhausting. However it would have changed things. You should have told me, and let me decide what to do with the truth, rather than deciding for me that I was better off in ignorance. You are right, he said, and the simplicity of it, the absence of excuse in it, was somehow harder to bear than any defense would have been. I was a coward, Eliza. I have faced down a rockslide apparently without flinching, or so they tell me, though I recall none of it. But I could not find the courage to tell a woman my true name, for fear of what her face would do when she heard it. The rider's knock came again at the door, more insistent now, and Julian closed his eyes briefly, as though gathering himself for a battle he had not chosen the timing of. I must go, he said. There are matters at Wrenmoor that cannot wait longer. Now that my whereabouts are known, my steward will have half the county searching for me by morning, and there is my betrothal to be settled, one way or another. And mourning still owed my father that I have put off too long already in running from it. But I will come back, Eliza. I will come back and I will tell you everything, the whole truth of my life and my house and my heart, and I will ask you nothing you are not ready to give. Only, please, do not close this door against me, before I have had the chance to earn my way back through it. She did not answer him. She could not, in that moment, trust her own voice not to break, and she would not give him the satisfaction. No, that was unfair. Even in her hurt she knew it was unfair. She would not give herself the vulnerability of weeping in front of a duke who had let her love a stranger for 3 weeks, without once correcting her understanding of who that stranger was. He left with the rider that night, and Eliza stood alone in her small cottage, in the wreckage of a wool skein still half-wound on the chair where he had sat, and felt the particular grief of a woman who has just learned that the ground beneath her own heart was never quite as solid as she had believed it to be. The weeks that followed were the longest of Eliza's life. Word travelled through the village within days, as word always did, that the injured quarry labourer nursed by Eliza Hartwell had been no labourer at all. But the Duke of Wrenmoor himself, come among them in disguise, for reasons no one could quite agree upon. Some said he had been fleeing debt, though the Duke was known to be wealthy beyond most men's imagining, so that explanation quickly withered. Others said he had been testing his tenants' honesty, sent by some whim of aristocratic curiosity, to see how the common folk truly lived and laboured. A few of the older women, more perceptive than the rest, said simply that grief did strange things to a young man, newly burdened with more responsibility than his heart was ready to bear, and that a man might run from a great house full of expectation to a quarry full of honest labour for no reason more complicated than needing, for a while, to be no one at all. Eliza said nothing to any of them. She went about her days as she always had, tending her orchard, taking in mending, helping when needed at the Quarry infirmary hut, and she told herself, with a firmness that convinced no one, least of all herself, that the Duke of Wrenmoor's affairs were no longer any concern of hers. But the village would not let the matter rest so easily. Mrs. Aldermere, who kept the dry goods shop and had opinions about everything, took to remarking loudly whenever Eliza came in for flour that it was no small thing, being nursed back to health by the very woman a duke might have died without. The quarryman who had carried Julian down from the ridge told and retold the story of the rescue, until it had grown, in the telling, into something almost legendary. Eliza digging through solid rock with her bare hands. Eliza breathing life back into a dying man. Eliza scolding a duke as though he were an ordinary farmhand, and being obeyed without question. She found herself, to her deep discomfort, becoming something of a minor celebrity in a village that had known her all her life as simply the quiet Hartwell girl who kept to herself since her mother's death. Worse than the gossip, though, was the letter that arrived a fortnight after Julian's departure, not from Julian himself, but from a woman signing herself Lady Vivian Carlyle, whom Eliza understood from the careful, cutting phrases of the letter to be the very betrothed Julian had spoken of on his last night in the cottage. The letter was brief and cold, and precise in the particular way that only a woman confident of her own superior position could afford to be. It informed Eliza that the Duke of Wrenmoor's brief and regrettable absence from society had been the result of a private matter now fully resolved, that his forthcoming marriage to Lady Vivian would proceed as planned within the season, and that the writer trusted Miss Hartwell would understand the impropriety of any further contact between herself and his Grace. Given the significant difference in their respective stations, a difference the writer was certain a sensible young woman would recognize as insurmountable. Eliza read the letter twice, standing at her own hearth with her hands not quite steady, and then she folded it carefully and set it upon the mantel, and told herself that she was not surprised, that she had known from the first moment she learned his true name that this was how such stories ended, that dukes did not marry the women who dug them out of quarry rubble, no matter how the village gossip liked to romanticize such things. She told herself this for 3 more weeks, and very nearly believed it, until the day a carriage bearing the ducal crest came rattling down the lane toward her cottage, and Eliza's traitorous heart leapt before her mind could catch up, and remind it of every reason it had no business leaping at all. It was not Julian who descended from the carriage, however, but an older woman, silver-haired and elegantly dressed, who introduced herself at the cottage door as Mrs. Prentice, the housekeeper of Wrenmoor Hall, and who asked, with a directness Eliza had not expected from so grand a personage, whether she might come in and speak plainly. "His Grace does not know I have come," Mrs. Prentice said once she was settled, somewhat incongruously, in the same small chair where Julian had once sat winding wool, "and I dare say he would be displeased if he learned of it, for he is a proud man in his own quiet way, and he would not wish to seem as though he was sending servants to plead his case for him. But I have served that family for 30 years, Miss Hartwell, and I have watched that boy grow from a grieving child into a burdened young man, and I have never, in all those years, seen him as he was in the fortnight after he returned to Wrenmoor from this village." "What do you mean?" Eliza asked, though something in her chest had already begun cautiously to hope. "I mean that he has broken his betrothal to Lady Vivienne," Mrs. Prentice said. "Against the strong counsel of every adviser his estate employs, against the wishes of his late father's oldest friends who arranged the match years ago, against, I might add, the considerable temper of Lady Vivienne herself, who is not a woman accustomed to being refused anything. He has spent these past weeks in mourning for his father, that he had, I think, been avoiding for 4 years, by burying himself in duty and obligation rather than grief. And he has spoken your name, Miss Hartwell, more times in my hearing than I believe he realizes." Eliza sat very still, her hands folded tightly in her lap, afraid that if she moved at all she might unravel entirely. "Then why has he not come himself?" "Because, Mrs. Prentice said gently, he does not believe you would receive him, and I confess I could not tell him with any certainty that he was wrong. He fears he has broken something between you that no amount of sincerity can mend, that having deceived you once, however gently, he has forfeited the right to ask for your trust again. He is, for all his rank, a man deeply afraid of a rejection he believes he has earned." "He did earn it," Eliza said, though her voice had lost the sharp edge it might have held a month before. "But earning a thing and being owed it forever after are not the same, are they?" Mrs. Prentice smiled, the first real warmth she had shown since entering the cottage. "No, my dear, I do not believe they are." Eliza might have let the matter rest there, might have allowed pride and hurt to keep her sealed away in her small cottage indefinitely, had it not been for what happened at the quarry 3 days later. It was a day like the one that had brought Julian into her life. Clear skies, the ring of hammers against stone, the ordinary rhythm of labor that had gone on at Hollow Ridge for longer than anyone living could remember. Eliza had come to deliver a basket of remedies to the infirmary hut, as she still did most weeks, when a shout went up from the eastern face of the quarry, and she turned in time to see a support timber give way beneath a cart loaded with cut stone, sending the whole load sliding toward a knot of workers too slow to scatter. Among them, she saw with a jolt that stopped her heart, was a boy no older than 10, the son of one of the quarrymen, who had been sent to fetch water and had wandered too near the working face, and who now stood frozen in the path of the sliding cart, with the particular paralysis of a child too frightened to remember his own legs could carry him to safety. Eliza did not remember crossing the distance between herself and the boy. She would tell herself afterward, in the strange calm that always seemed to descend upon her in such moments, that her body simply moved before her mind gave it permission, the way it had moved toward the rockslide weeks before. She reached the boy a bare instant before the cart would have struck him, seized him about the waist, and threw them both clear into the loose gravel at the path's edge, feeling the wind of the cart's passage close enough to stir her skirts. The boy wailed with fright rather than injury, and Eliza held him close, her own heart hammering, until his father came running to gather him up with tears of gratitude streaming unashamed down his weathered face. It was only then, in the aftermath, brushing gravel from her torn sleeve and trying to steady her own shaking hands, that Eliza looked up and saw Julian standing at the edge of the gathering crowd, still and pale, his eyes fixed on her with an expression of such raw, unguarded fear and relief and love commingled, that she felt the breath go out of her entirely. He had come, she understood in that instant, to see her, had perhaps been standing at the quarry's edge, working up whatever courage a duke required to face a woman he feared, had every right to refuse him, and had instead watched her run toward danger a second time, exactly as fearlessly as she had the first, and something in his face told her that whatever doubt or hesitation had brought him to that quarry that morning had been burned away entirely by the sight of her risking her life for a stranger's child. He crossed the distance between them without seeming to notice the ground beneath his feet, and stopped before her, and for a long moment neither of them spoke at all. "You might have been killed," he said finally, his voice rough. "So might you," Eliza answered, "on the day I dug you out of that rockslide. And yet here you stand, very much alive, lecturing me about the dangers of doing exactly what you yourself required of a stranger. That is not the same thing. It is precisely the same thing." But there was no real anger in it now, only a kind of exhausted tenderness that surprised her with its intensity. "I could not stand by and watch a child die in front of me any more than I could stand by and watch you die beneath that stone. It is not courage, Julian. I told you before. It is only that I cannot live with the alternative." "I told you," he said, and his voice had gone unsteady, "that I believed that to be precisely what courage was. I believe it more now than I did then." "Mrs. Prentice came to see me," Eliza said, watching his face carefully. "She told me of Lady Vivienne." Something like hope, fragile and unpracticed, moved across his features. "I broke the betrothal the day after I returned to Wrenmoor. I could not marry a woman I did not love, not after I had learned, in your cottage, what it felt like to be known, truly known. Not as a title or an inheritance or a duty, but as myself, by someone who had no reason to want anything from me at all. I could not go back to a life built on the absence of that, once I understood what its presence felt like. You let me believe, for 3 weeks, that you were an ordinary man. I let myself believe it too," he said quietly. "That is the truth I did not tell you before, Eliza. Not fully. It was not only cowardice that kept me silent about my name. It was that for the first time since my father died, I was permitted to simply be a man, clumsy with wool, grateful for kindness, cared for without calculation, and I was so hungry for that ordinary grace that I could not bear to end it by speaking a title that would have changed everything you felt toward me. That was selfish of me. I know it was, but it was not, I think, entirely a lie, because the man you nursed in that cottage was more truly myself than the Duke who arrived at Wrenmoor to face down his advisers and break his betrothal and spend 4 years' worth of unwept grief for his father in the space of a fortnight. You did not fall in love with a disguise, Eliza, if you felt anything for me at all in those weeks. You felt it for the truest version of me that I have been in years." Eliza felt the tears she had been holding back for a month finally rise, hot and unbidden, and did not try to stop them. "I did feel something," she admitted, her voice breaking on the words. "I have been telling myself for a month that I did not, that it was foolishness, that a village girl has no business grieving the loss of a duke she knew for 3 weeks, under a false name. But I have grieved it every day since you left Julian, and I am tired of pretending otherwise." He reached for her hands then, the same hands that had dug him from beneath a fallen mountain and stitched his wounds with lace thread and thrown a frightened child clear of a runaway cart, and held them as though they were something infinitely precious. "Then let me spend whatever years are given to us proving that the man in that cottage was not a disguise, but the truth of who I wish to be for the rest of my life," he said. "I do not ask you to become a duchess for the sake of rank or wealth, or any of the things society will tell you such a marriage ought to promise. I ask you because I have never in all my life felt as entirely myself as I did in your keeping, and I do not wish to feel that way with anyone else, ever again." The quarryman had gathered at a respectful distance, the boy's father still clutching his son close, and the whole of Hallow Ridge seemed to hold its breath in the golden light of that ordinary morning turned suddenly extraordinary. You would have your household, your county, your late father's oldest friends, all watching a quarry girl take a duchess's place, Eliza said. Though there was no longer any real resistance in it, only the last instinctive caution of a woman unaccustomed to trusting good fortune. "Let them watch," Julian said. "Let them watch a woman who ran toward danger twice, while braver-seeming men stood frozen, who nursed a stranger back to health with no thought of what he might owe her, who scolded a duke for trying to rise too soon, and was obeyed without argument. I think, in time, they will understand precisely why I could not have chosen anyone else." She laughed then, through her tears, the sound startling a few of the watching quarrymen into relieved smiles of their own. And when Julian drew her gently into his arms, careful still of ribs not fully healed, careful too of the fragile, precious thing being built between them, in full view of the village that had once known her only as the quiet Hartwell girl, Eliza let herself, at last, stop bracing against a happiness she had been so certain she was not permitted to keep. The wedding, when it came that autumn, was held not at Wrenmoor's grand chapel, as tradition and Julian's advisers both urged, but in the small village church at the edge of Hollow Ridge, its stone walls hung with orchard branches, heavy with late apples, its narrow aisle crowded with quarrymen in their best coats, and village women who had known Eliza since her christening, all of them witness to a match that had begun not in a ballroom or a drawing-room, but in the wreckage of a rockslide, built on nothing grander than one woman's refusal to stand still, while someone else's life hung in the balance. Mrs. Prentice wept openly through the ceremony, declaring afterward that she had not seen the young Duke smile so freely since before his father's death. The boy Eliza had pulled from beneath the runaway cart stood at the front of the gathered crowd, scrubbed and solemn in his father's borrowed coat, and presented her, with great ceremony, a small bouquet of Quarry wildflowers he had picked himself, which Eliza carried down the aisle in place of the hothouse roses Wrenmoor's gardeners had offered. And when Julian took her hands before the altar, the same hands that had dug him from beneath the mountain, that had stitched his wounds and wound wool and thrown a frightened child clear of danger, he did not speak of dukedoms or duty, or the great house waiting to receive her, but only of the particular grace of being known, fully and without pretense, by someone who had first loved him not as a duke, but as a stranger worth saving, and who had gone on loving him once she learned the truth of who that stranger was. They walked from the church together into the low gold light of an autumn afternoon, past the orchard where Eliza had once lived alone with her solitude and her grief, past the lane where a ducal carriage had once come rattling with a housekeeper's careful hope, toward Hollow Ridge itself, where the quarrymen had laid down their tools for the day and gathered at the ridge's edge to cheer the passing of the woman who had dug their Duke from beneath a fallen stone, with nothing but her own 2 hands and a refusal to let him go, and who had, in the doing of it, found her way not to a title or a fortune, but to the truest kind of love there is, the kind built first in the dark, before either of them knew what the light would later reveal, and strong enough, once revealed, to hold.